Thank you. I like to acknowledge my co-authors, Tomas, Frejka, and Goldscheider, to be here. And in company with these two, I'm the baby of the two. So the baby is out of its own. This paper is not longer work in progress. It's just been published in comparative population studies, so you can have a closer look there if you like. So our starting point is the gender evolution framework, and the idea that there is a strong relationship between gender changes and family changes. The gender evolution is seen as a two-part process, where first half contains more gender equality in the public sphere, with a massive increase in female labor force participation. And the second half contains more gender equality in the private sphere, with men's increasing involvement in tasks of home and family. These two processes are indeed related, where women's employment encourages men's increased involvement in the home. However, one could also say it is a weak relationship, as men's involvement at home has not followed the same pace as women's employment, which often is referred to as the second shift. And one should therefore look at them separately. The two halves of the gender revolution may have different consequences for the families, where the first is having a major negative consequence. For example, people delay family formation as a response to increased female human capital, or the number of children is decreasing in order to reduce work-family conflict. And contrary to the first half, the second half is predicted to have a positive consequence for the families. That is, men's increased involvement in the home has the promise of increasing fertility. Already here, I think it's important to stress that no country have reached the end of either the first or the second half of the gender revolution. This means we do not know the final response to the two halves, and we can only look at the direction at this point. The aim of this paper is to examine the connection between the growth of female labor force participation relative to that of men, and the growth of men's domestic participation relative to women's, and the relationship with cohort fertility across a wide range of industrialized countries. And more specifically, we ask, do countries with patterns that minimize the second shift experience less drastic decline or even increase in fertility than those seen in countries whose pattern maximize the second shift? We use national information on cohort fertility and on labor force participation, and different surveys on time use. The period is 1960 to 2010. And we include 11 countries covering Northern Europe, Western Central Europe, Southern Europe, and North America. So, in basic, we have 4 different measures, and we discuss the relationship between them. That's the purpose of this paper. And our first measure is cohort fertility. And we measure it at age 40, and we cover the cohorts between 1920 to 1973. And data for this, we use the Human Fertility Database. And the components of the gender revolution, which is more a period measure, is linked to cohorts at age 27. So, for example, the gender revolution measures around 1960 are associated with the complete fertility rate of the 1933 cohort, which are 27 in 1960. The first measure of the gender revolution is employment, which is the ratio of female labor force participation to male labor force participation. second is domestic hours, which is the ratio of men's domestic hours to women's. And the last measure is the second shift, which is the ratio of employment divided by the ratio of domestic hours. So this is a true descriptive analysis where we examine the trends and patterns in the 4 measures for clusters of countries. And more data would be needed for more advanced statistical techniques, but that will be left for the future. So this figure shows fertility, cohort fertility rates, and is well-known rates for many of you, and where the general pattern is that there is a fertility decline in all the analysed countries. In Northern Europe, it stabilized around 2 births per woman for those born in the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s. And both Western, Central Europe and Southern Europe experienced much lower fertility among recent cohorts, except for France. And given these various country patterns of cohort fertility rates, the question we now ask is how these fertility patterns of the late 20th centuries relate to changes in our 3 measure of gender changes. So the massive change in female employment between 1960 and 2010 is evident in this figure, but there were considerable variation in temporal patterns. In Northern Europe, it increased rapidly to settle at a level of 0.9 in 1990, while in Western Central Europe and North America, the process was more gradual, reaching close to 0.9 in 2010. In Southern Europe, levels all along were lower than elsewhere, reaching 0.7 to 0.8 early in the 21st century. And during the period we are looking at here, all countries experienced decline in cohort fertility. And from our point of view, the overall patterns of fertility change and change in female employment suggest that the first half of the gender revolution is far from complete in many of these countries, and its negative effect of the fertility are likely far from complete as well. Although the general trend of domestic work remained lower than employment throughout the period, the regional variation in domestic work follows the pattern of employment, with high levels for the Northern European countries, low levels for the Southern European countries, and with the Western Central in between. And our impression is that the overall pattern in domestic work do little to account for change in cohort fertility. And taken together, one could even argue that increasing men's share reduces fertility. However, what might be operating is not the absolute trends in employment and domestic work, but the relationship with each other, women's second shift. So that we are looking at now. And this figure shows the measure of second shift, which is a ratio of the ratio, dividing the employment ratio by the domestic work ratio. The higher the value, the greater the second shift. The overall impression is that women's burden is considerably greater than men's. And prior to 1990, there was a little pattern, there was very little pattern and very little change, shown by the largely random pattern of percent change shown here. But thereafter, the major trend is slightly down, indicating a reduction in women's second shift. And around 2000, it converged around 1.5. So we expected that a declining second shift ratio would generate an increase in cohort fertility, as women's burden is declining. However, we do not find support for this. And one explanation for this might be that increasing female employment is continuing a downward pressure on childbearing. So our starting point was that the two halves of the gender revolution is related to cohort fertility. And so far, the gender revolution have not generated a turnaround in cohort fertility. One possible reason for this is that the depressing effect of the first part of the gender revolution are still operative. However, there is indications that wherever the gender revolution have made significant progress, cohort fertility declined the least. And there is also indications that where the gender revolution made the least progress, cohort fertility have experienced the steepest decline. And only time will tell how this is going to end. And I guess this is when I say that more research is needed.